Margaret Whitfield married
We
Daniel
did it.
Whitfield in
Yes, we
1994 in
did.
a
I
small
love you
Lutheran
so
church
much.
outside Asheville, North Carolina, with 60 guests and a borrowed wedding dress that belonged to her sister. For 28 years, she believed she knew everything about the man she married. She knew his coffee order, his mother's maiden name, the way he hummed off-key when he thought no one was listening, and the exact spot on his left shoulder where an old football injury still ached when it rained. What she did not know, what she would not learn until the spring of 2022, was that somewhere in a filing cabinet 2 counties away, her husband's name appeared on a trust document worth $11 million, a document that had existed for 19 years, and that she had never once been told it was there. This is the story of how Margaret found that filing cabinet, what it cost her to open it, and what she discovered about the man she had shared a bed with for almost 3 decades. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It started, as these things often do, with a phone call that should have meant nothing. In March of 2022, Margaret was sitting at her kitchen table in Hendersonville, going through a stack of mail that had piled up over a long, tiring week, when a woman from a law office in Charlotte introduced herself and asked to speak with Daniel Whitfield regarding the estate of his late uncle, Harold Whitfield. Margaret remembered Harold only vaguely, a quiet man who sent Christmas cards and rarely came to family gatherings, a man Daniel always described as distant, almost a stranger. She told the woman that Daniel was at work and asked what this was regarding. The woman paused, the kind of pause that makes a person's stomach tighten before they understand why, and said she wasn't able to discuss the details with anyone other than the named beneficiary or his spouse, given the size of the estate involved. Margaret asked, carefully, what size she meant. The woman on the phone hesitated again, then said the words that would unravel everything Margaret thought she understood about her marriage, that the trust in question was valued at just over $11 million, and that, according to their records, Daniel had been aware of its existence since 2003. Teased the central mystery, 2:30 to 4:30. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. She sat with the phone pressed to her ear in the same kitchen where she had made Daniel's lunch every morning for 19 years, and she tried to make the math work in her head, because 19 years was not a small number. 19 years meant Daniel had known about this fortune while their daughter was still in middle school. It meant he had known about it during the year they nearly lost the house, when they sat together at this very table arguing over which bills could wait another month. It meant he had known about it through 2 job losses, 1 bankruptcy scare, and 100 small humiliations that Margaret had quietly absorbed so that her family would never have to feel as poor as they sometimes were. 3 questions formed in her mind that day, questions that would follow her for the rest of this story. Why would a man let his wife struggle for nearly 2 decades while sitting on a fortune he never mentioned? What kind of arrangement had he made with his uncle to keep it hidden? And once Margaret knew the truth, what was she going to do with it? To understand how something like this could happen inside a marriage, it helps to understand who Margaret and Daniel were before any of it came apart. Margaret grew up in Brevard, the younger of 2 daughters, raised by a mother who cleaned houses on weekdays and a father who drove a delivery route for a regional bakery. Money in that house was something you watched closely and spoke about rarely, the way some families avoid talking about illness. Margaret carried that habit into adulthood. She balanced a checkbook by hand long after banks stopped expecting anyone to. She clipped coupons not out of necessity alone, but because the act itself felt like control in a world that had given her very little of it growing up. When she met Daniel at a community college night class in 1992, she was drawn to how steady he seemed, how unbothered by the things that kept her up at night. He worked in equipment sales, made a modest but reliable income, and never once, in all the years she knew him, gave any outward sign that his family carried more money in its bloodline than her own family had seen in 3 generations combined. Daniel's side of the story began somewhere else entirely, in a part of his life he rarely discussed. His father's older brother, Harold Whitfield, had made a quiet fortune decades earlier through a chain of regional hardware stores he built up across the Carolinas before selling the business in the late 1980s for a sum that, even then, was substantial. Harold never married, never had children of his own, and according to relatives who spoke about him only in passing, kept his finances as private as a man could keep anything in a small southern town where everyone tends to know everyone else's business eventually. Daniel had always described his uncle the same way to Margaret, a man who was around for holidays sometimes and not other times, a man who didn't involve himself much in the family. It was a description that, looking back, gave away almost nothing, and Margaret would later wonder whether that vagueness had been a choice rather than an accident. What no one outside of Harold's small circle of advisors knew was that in 2003, the same year Margaret and Daniel were stretching every paycheck to cover their daughter's school expenses and a car repair they couldn't really afford, Harold had quietly placed Daniel as the primary beneficiary of an irrevocable trust. The trust held investment accounts, a minority stake in a commercial property partnership, and a modest piece of undeveloped land outside Greenville, South Carolina, that would later increase dramatically in value. Harold's attorney at the time would later testify, in a deposition Margaret's lawyer eventually obtained, that Harold had structured the trust specifically so that Daniel could not access the principal until Harold's death, but that Daniel had been formally notified of his status as beneficiary, in writing, in the fall of 2003. Daniel had signed an acknowledgement of that notification himself. The signature on that document was never in dispute. What was in dispute, for years afterward, was everything Daniel did and did not do in the 19 years that followed. When Daniel came home from work that evening in March, Margaret was waiting for him at the same kitchen table, the phone still resting where she'd set it down hours earlier. She told him about the call exactly as it happened, word for word, watching his face the entire time. She would later describe that moment to her sister as the first time in 28 years she had seen her husband's expression go completely blank, not surprised, not confused, simply still, the way a person goes still when they are deciding how much of the truth to give away. Daniel admitted it almost immediately. He told her yes, he had known about the trust since 2003, that his uncle Harold had explained it to him at the time, and that he had simply chosen not to bring it up because, in his words, it wasn't real money. Not yet, not until Harold actually passed, and there had never seemed to be a good moment to mention something that complicated and that far off. Margaret asked him the question that mattered most. She asked him why, during the year they nearly lost the house, during the months she had taken on extra shifts cleaning offices at night while he slept, during every single conversation they'd ever had about money being tight, he had never once said a single word about a fortune that had his name attached to it. Daniel's answer, delivered quietly and without much conviction, was that the money belonged to Harold while Harold was alive, that it wasn't really his to count on, and that he hadn't wanted to build their life around a number that might never materialize. Margaret sat with that answer for a long time before she said anything else. It wasn't that the explanation was impossible to believe. It was that it explained the silence around the money, but not the silence around everything else. All the conversations they could have had honestly instead of through gritted teeth and short tempers. Conversations about what they were really afraid of and why. Over the following weeks, Margaret began quietly gathering information, partly out of a need to understand the full shape of what she'd married into, and partly because some instinct she couldn't yet name was telling her this wasn't finished. She learned that Harold had passed away in January of that year, just 2 months before the phone call, and that Daniel had already been in contact with the estate's attorneys before Margaret ever found out anything at all. He had not told her about his uncle's death. He had not told her that the inheritance was now active, no longer a distant hypothetical but a real, transferable sum of money sitting in an account with his name on it. When Margaret confronted him with this, Daniel said he'd been waiting for the right time, that he was still processing his uncle's death, that he hadn't meant to keep it from her so long. But 2 months is not a small window for a man to forget to mention $11 million to the woman he has shared a bedroom with for nearly 3 decades, and Margaret began to understand that this wasn't a single secret she had stumbled into. It was a pattern, one that had simply never been tested until now. What made the discovery harder to absorb wasn't only the money itself. It was the small, specific memories that came rushing back to Margaret once she knew what she now knew. The Christmas in 2009, when she had quietly sold her late mother's jewelry to help cover their daughter's college tuition deposit, never telling Daniel how much it had hurt to let those pieces go. The summer in 2014, when Daniel had taken on a second job, supposedly to help with expenses, while an $11 million trust sat untouched 2 counties away with his name already attached to it. Margaret began to replay nearly every financial conversation of her marriage through this new, unbearable lens, and what she found waiting for her in that replay wasn't comfort. It was the slow, sinking realization that she had spent years being afraid of a future her husband already knew, on some level, was never going to look the way he let her believe it would. Margaret didn't file for divorce immediately, and she would later say that surprised people more than almost anything else in the story. She wanted, first, to understand exactly what she was dealing with, because trust, once broken in a marriage, doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes in stages, and Margaret found herself moving through those stages with the same careful, methodical instinct she had once used to stretch a grocery budget. She hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, precise woman named Carol Reyes, who specialized in tracing hidden and undisclosed assets in long marriages. Carol's job was to determine not just what the trust contained now, but what Daniel had done with any portion of it, if anything, in the years since 2003. It was Carol who first discovered that Daniel had, in fact, accessed a small distribution from the trust back in 2011, a discretionary payment Harold had approved while still alive, totaling just under $40,000. Daniel had never mentioned this either. He had used part of it, according to bank records Carol traced, to pay down a credit card balance he had told Margaret, at the time, came from a work bonus. The discovery of that smaller, earlier deception mattered more to Margaret than the $11 million itself. It told her that this had never been about waiting for the right moment to share difficult, complicated news. It told her that Daniel had been capable, for over a decade, of constructing small, plausible lies to cover the seams where the truth might have shown through. Margaret's sister, who had watched the marriage from a close distance for nearly 30 years, later said in an interview for this story that she had always found Daniel pleasant but unreadable, the kind of man who answered questions fully without ever quite revealing anything underneath them. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Looking back, she said, it explained more than she wished it did. As the months went on, the family around Margaret and Daniel began to split, quietly at first, into different versions of the same story. Daniel's mother insisted her son had simply been protecting his wife from stress over an inheritance that wasn't guaranteed. Margaret's sister insisted Daniel had protected no one but himself. Their daughter, now in her 20s, found herself caught in the middle, unwilling to fully condemn the father who had raised her, unable to ignore what her mother had lived through without ever knowing it. Margaret, for her part, stopped trying to assign a single motive to Daniel's silence. She had come to believe, through months of legal conversations and long nights replaying old memories, that people rarely hide one thing for one clean reason. They hide it because the truth, once spoken, requires a kind of accountability they aren't ready to face, and the longer the silence lasts, the harder that accountability becomes to offer. The turning point in this story came not from the original trust at all, but from something Carol Reyes found buried in a secondary set of records nearly 4 months into her investigation. Harold Whitfield, it turned out, had not structured the entire estate the way Daniel had always implied. While the $11 million trust was real and irrevocable, Harold had also, in the final 2 years of his life, quietly transferred a separate parcel of commercial real estate directly into an LLC that listed Daniel as its sole managing member. This transfer had nothing to do with the trust Margaret had first learned about. It had happened entirely outside of it, recorded in county property filings that Carol had to request specifically because they didn't appear in any of the documents Daniel had initially disclosed to his own divorce attorney. The property, a small commercial strip near a growing interstate exchange outside Greenville, had been worth a modest sum at the time of transfer. By the time Carol uncovered it, due to nothing more dramatic than regional development and rising land values, it was worth close to $2.5 million on its own, separate and apart from the trust everyone had already been arguing over. Daniel had never disclosed this property at any point during the divorce proceedings, not in his financial affidavit, not in his sworn deposition, not in a single conversation with Margaret or her attorneys. When confronted with the property records in a deposition that Margaret's legal team had specifically requested, Daniel's composure, which had held for months, finally broke. He admitted that he had hoped the LLC, structured under a slightly different name than his own, would simply go unnoticed in the broader proceedings. He said he hadn't meant for it to look the way it now looked. But under North Carolina's equitable distribution laws, deliberately concealing marital or separately disclosable assets during a divorce isn't a matter of how something looks. It carries real legal consequences, and Margaret's attorney made certain the court understood exactly what had been hidden and for how long. The court's ruling, when it finally came, did not unfold the way either Margaret or Daniel had expected. Because Daniel had knowingly failed to disclose the Greenville property during a legal proceeding that required full financial transparency, the judge applied a remedy available under state law for deliberate concealment, awarding Margaret a significantly larger share of the disclosed marital estate than she likely would have received had Daniel been honest from the beginning. It was, in a strange and quietly devastating way, the opposite of what Daniel's silence had been designed to protect. The very secrecy meant to shield part of his inheritance from division ended up costing him more of it than transparency ever would have. Margaret did not walk away from this story wealthy beyond imagination. The original $11 million trust remained largely Daniel's separate inheritance under the law, untouched by the divorce in its core structure. But the concealed property, the smaller deceptions Carol had traced back through a decade of bank statements, and the credibility Daniel lost in the eyes of the court combined to leave Margaret with a settlement that allowed her, for the first time in her adult life, real financial independence. What stayed with Margaret longest, by her own account, wasn't the money at all. It was the slow, painful recognition that she had spent 28 years measuring her own worth against a scarcity that had never fully been real, not in the way she believed it to be. She has since said, in the only public interview she ever gave about this story, that she doesn't regret the years of frugality or hard work, because those things shaped a strength in her she still relies on today. What she regrets is the years she spent afraid, quietly, of futures that her husband already knew, on some level, were not the futures they would actually face. Was justice really served in this story? The court certainly believed so. But ask yourself this. If you discovered tomorrow that someone you trusted completely had carried a secret like this for 19 years, would you have seen the signs along the way? Or would you, like Margaret, have only understood the full shape of it looking backward? So tell us in the comments below, what would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have forgiven the silence if Daniel had come forward on his own, before the truth forced its way out through a stranger's phone call? Or was 19 years simply too long a silence to ever fully repair? And if this story moved you, wait until you hear what happened to the family who discovered, almost by accident, that their quiet, unassuming grandmother had been sitting on a small fortune of her own for over 40 years, and the choice she made in her final days that none of them saw coming. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss one of our upcoming videos. And if you have a story of your own about family, money, or a secret that changed everything, we'd love to hear it in the comments below.